one fun thing just as a folks to read is some of you might know from last year, Madhu had engaged. Madhu is a faculty in McGill, and he works on TB in the context of TB implementation science very broadly. He's an epidemiologist. But one of the other things that Madhu does is he is a big champion of equity and affordability, and he writes for the Forbes. And very recently, he wrote a fun article about role of engineers in global health. I was talking to him about it, so it was kind of it's a fun. I'll send this as a link. And I think the perspective there is quite interesting. I think some of that is obvious to many of you who are engaging in this field much more as engineers thinking about solutions. But it's also valuable very broadly to also hear about a very broad range of engineers that he interviewed. So there's roughly around 27 or so folks from around the world, including the breadth of engineering practices that are implemented in global health. It's a fun read for folks that are interested and kind of see themselves heading in these sets of directions, and what are the challenges, what sites of things excite folks, when is the moment of time that people will transition and turn this into really a career and a full-time effort. So anyway, I think it's a good reflection. Madhu writes very broadly on a range of topics in global health. Okay, so with that as a kind of an intro, we'll switch to today's discussion because I want to be kind of careful of time, because I want to transition to one-on-one office hours for projects. The goal of this lecture really is much more of a practical one, is to first give a sense of the broad range of open source licensing options that exist for technologies, project solutions. And we have Ethan from my lab joining today. I'll have Ethan do a quick intro, and Ethan is really a big champion of diving deeply in both understanding the sets of how both from the software industry, but also how many of the software open source licenses have been then reutilized in many hardware projects as well. Ethan and I have a project on, amongst many other things, thinking a little bit about a framework for pros and cons of open source context in the medical device perspective. So this is something that is a core part of Ethan's PhD as well. And so we'll kind of spend some time. We'll do this first as a talk from Ethan. And then what I'm hoping, Ethan, is we can also have people interrupt us during the talk itself. But after the talk itself, it would be valuable for anybody who wants to really think about this open source context and apply them to projects that you may have done in the past or projects that you're doing. We will really think about the caveats of what exists, what needs to exist, and how certain doors open with these types of approaches and certain doors you have to be careful about. So I think with that, I'm going to pass to Ethan. And I think, yeah, maybe Ethan, you can also do a quick intro for yourself before you start.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Ethan. I'm a fourth year PhD student in the news lab. Over the past 4 years, I worked on various software and hardware things, different kinds of instrumentation projects in the lab. Right now, I'm focusing on a software project that's kind of related to connecting microscopes and people who use microscopes together across the world in an online platform where they could kind of interact with each other, see the different ecologies around the world through the microscopes. Yeah. So we're calling that kind of a robotic microscopy network, and we're exploring that concept. Yeah, so what I'll be talking about today kind of comes more from a previous project I was working on, which was, this was like around the early times of the COVID pandemic. We got involved in a project that was developing an open source ventilator for COVID patients, and particularly in lower resource settings. And we were working on that project as kind of an open source design. So naturally it came up with the question of how are we going to share this in a way that other people will build it or build upon that work. So I spent a lot of time diving deep into this complicated legal world of licensing and open source licenses and open hardware licenses. And the talk I'll be giving today is kind of basically that, everything that I learned from that.
Yeah, and then just before you jump in, Ethan, kind of one of the key things for, I don't know if in my previous conversations I had described this project, but the project is called PES Global, and it's useful for folks to kind of navigate this as a framework. And something what is very special that we realized, and I think this is also kind of an academic layer to this, is we use PES Global as a framework of thinking about how to explore the notion of open reference designs, especially where there is a regulatory component involved in approval of medical devices, and especially when these medical devices might even belong in a context of critical care. So I think today's discussion is all the way from projects that might be non-medical, but also the more delicate part where these are critical care devices that have very specific regulatory frameworks. The other context that I want people to bring up questions about, which we explored, which was non-trivial in PES Global, was the international, the rules and laws that might exist in India versus what might exist in Nepal and Kenya and Chile will be very different. So we use this framework to also think about making sure that there's a certain sense of international context involved in it. And then of course the team was also diverse and distributed across many countries itself. And the project still continues, but one of the factors that we've been thinking about is this to become a case study for us, at least, in trying to understand what is the intersection between medical devices and open source hardware licensing. But we'll start first with the licensing side, and then in the end, we can also discuss this project in a much more detail. But we can also just choose, you all can choose projects that you're involved in as well.
Yeah, all right, so I'll get started. So just kind of before we start, I do want to qualify that I'm not a lawyer, so none of this should be taken as legal advice. And then if you have any questions, like for example, specific to your project, feel free to just email me here. So licenses are basically these legal documents, and for the purposes of today, we can think of them as legal documents that are under intellectual property law, so like copyrights, patents, things that kind of limit what people can do with something. And then also contract law, which is kind of something more in the business world, like who can be sued for what, under what conditions, and that kind of stuff. And then licenses are also documents that people use to give other people legal permissions to do certain things with their work. And the reason I mention this is that licenses really are a tool that you can choose to use or not use to support your project's goal or based on your project strategy and depending on your project's timeline. So usually, like at a minimum, projects, people who work on projects care about not getting sued, about like making some kind of impact with what they're doing, and about sustaining the project, keeping it going, which could take many different forms, whether that's kind of financial sustainability, having some source of money that people can spend time to work on the project, or like other forms of sustainability, like building a community of people who will work on a volunteer basis on that project or other things. Maybe since this is kind of like the only interactive part of my talk, if people who are working on projects can kind of share what they're working on and what their goals are, and I can kind of tie that into some things that might be relevant to consider here.
Yeah, so to add to the comment, just first of all, the one comment that I'll make there is just like ethics and many sets of scenarios of as you're building your projects, there is a sense of self that you bring to the project. So this list is very much, this is not a priority list in any way. The way that the order it's listed will change. And on purpose, I know Ethan has left this to be incomplete. So I really do want you to think about, when you are thinking about something, what are the minimal goals for all of you when you're trying to tackle a problem? And some of the obvious ones we already know, but I think it's useful for people to think about that none of this aspect is prescriptive in any way. We all have many different motivations when we start, and there is no judgment also in terms of those sets of, so building something that is financially viable, that also brings not just scale, but also financial value to an individual, is nothing. It's just, it should be listed if that is one of the goals. There is nothing right or wrong in any of those. Shying away from that, a framework may or may not work for your own individual goals is absolutely worth stating and being unambiguous about. But there is not a judgment associated with this, because you are bringing your own self to the table when you're working on a project. Do people want to add?
I'm wondering, in terms of the projects that we're developing in the class, if they turn into something that's feasible and usable, does Stanford have a piece of that, and is that required that they then do the licensing?
Yeah, maybe let me just clarify this. I think this is valuable as even as a background. So as Stanford students, employees, any intellectual property that we file, if we file that as an IP, Stanford is listed as, a key co-owner of any of the work that we do. During, I think it's a little bit subtle for students if certain work was done outside Stanford settings. There are cases in which that can be outside Stanford, but again, any teaching and research, and of course, very directly faculty is involved. Stanford is involved, but that does not mean that you don't have a say in how you would like to bring a project or a world to life. And what that means also is it's not just applicable only for things where IP is filed, but there is a much broader universe that Ethan will talk about that goes beyond just filing patents. When a patent is filed, you have a conversation with what is called the Office of Science, OTL, Technology and Licensing. And I will, maybe in the very end, I can talk about some case examples when we have gone through these licenses on the IP side of the story as well, of how to both negotiate and engage to figure out what, is the licensing approach actually meeting the big goals of a project, for example. And some of that is called global access. Some of that is also associated with different types of licenses for different markets itself. But let's leave that part a little bit aside, and then we'll come back to it after this overall open source discussion.
Yeah, the simplified summary is if you file a patent for a project in this class, then you have to file a patent through Stanford. Of course, you could choose not to file a patent. And then if you do file a patent, then you get to kind of choose the strategy for how things go with that patent. And we can discuss this more towards the end if there's interest in like kind of this whole patent thing. But that's also kind of relevant to the licensing, open source license side of the story, because open source licenses address patents. But patents basically give you a tool that you can use to control how people use the thing that you filed the patent for. And then open source licenses can kind of modify or give other people blanket permissions for some pieces of what the patent might control. I guess maybe in the interest of time, I'll just list out a few like additional project goals. This is of course not an exhaustive list, but often people don't want their work to be plagiarized, for example, for someone else to like take their work and pass it off under someone else's name. So this might be some concern that you might have. You might be interested in having other people build on the work, or building communities to contribute to the work, which kind of goes back to the sustainability piece. And of course, there's many other project goals. And really the set of goals that your specific project has is what should drive how you choose your strategy for kind of sharing your work or not sharing your work.
So just before, was there anything that was not listed that people felt very strongly about? Just as this is, oh, go ahead. I see one hand at the, is that you, Emily? I don't see you. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, I would say like a personal goal of mine is just to get more comfortable with the ideation and de-risking process as a whole, just because I think we were talking about it when we were talking with you, Manu, but just like learning how to do this whole process is really important. So when you finally find something that you're really, really passionate and ready to run with, like being able to replicate it in a successful way. That's it.
Yeah, and I think that falls a little bit outside the preview of this question, which is the goal of the class itself, is to do this multiple number of times. And it's actually also true when you file your first patent in life, you realize its limitations. And when you file your first open source project, you also realize its limitations. So all of these are iterative processes to understand and appreciate, which is also the bigger goal of the class.
Right. And I think the place where it connects with this talk is really kind of this idea of risk. So really licenses and open source licenses are kind of a way for you to reduce your risk and reduce the amount of work that you have to do. Once you like choose it and like copy a few files in, then usually you don't have to think too much more about it. Whereas without the license, then you would have to like negotiate or deal with lawyers and stuff, and that's not as fun. So this is really a way to kind of de-risk things and simplify various pieces related to sharing your work. And so really like kind of the why do we care about licenses? It's one piece of it is sometimes you might be required to share your work under license. So that might apply if you use somebody else's project and their project came with a license that required you to like share any changes you made to their project or share anything you did that built off of their work. But the other reason, like even if you don't use a project that requires you to use some license, if you don't have a license, then other people don't really have permission to do things with your work, like use or copy your work. They are liable to being sued by you, even if you don't intend to sue them. But also you aren't protected from getting sued by other people for many different kinds of things. So this matters if like you're developing a medical device and you're giving it away for free. You probably don't want people to sue you for that. But in order to make that happen, you have to choose a license that where if people use your work, then they also agree not to sue you for using your work. That's probably relevant to at least some of your projects. And then the final piece of this is that license terms impact how other people will interact with your project, what they do with it, who feels like they can use your project, who feels like the project is kind of off limits to them for legal or business reasons. And so that's kind of important as part of what your project strategy is for making some kind of impact.
And then just one clarification there, which is a very subtle one, but extremely important. And now since we chose medical devices as one example that Ethan had just mentioned, medical devices is the hardest one because we are talking about an open source framework and we are talking about human life. So as you're building sets of projects, it is not about that the liability of an entity that is really putting a product in the market is not reduced. It's just, it has to be clear who has the liability when something goes wrong. So, there can be a project online where people had described about certain sets of things, but that is not a product. And the sets of products that are released to the general public where a certain product is actually being used, and when something goes wrong, there is actually a regulatory framework around who will essentially be responsible and what are the sets of factors that have to undergo before. So, just because something is in open source does not imply any way or form that the regulatory framework can be cut short. The regulatory framework still exists. You still have to, before something is launched into a space, any market for that matter, anybody for profit or not profit, as long as there is human usage in a commercial type of a context, or even in a deployable type of a context, whether that entity makes any profit or not, there are certain sets of liabilities, but those sets of principles are fall into the regulatory umbrella. While this is even at the beginning, when you are starting and you want to engage a larger research community, you want to engage and not be top secret about the work that you are doing, and you want people to critically provide feedback early on as well. Or you might, which in our case, the reason we released PES Global in early phase is we wanted many other communities, including NASA, researchers all across the world who are also working on similar ideas, to band together. And literally, quite literally, because of that license, we had 6 to 7 large research groups come together under that one umbrella. So I just want this to be clear, that it's not as if the ethical framework does not go away, and our responsibility as engineers in producing and de-risking engineering solutions that have a very direct connection in medical context does not go away.
Right. Yeah, this talk is specifically about the legal related stuff of sharing your work, sharing your designs, but it's an entirely separate world when you're talking about building, manufacturing something and putting it into the hands of users. That's all under the medical device regulations. And with different types of medical devices, there are different regulations.
And I'll cover a little bit of that next Wednesday, a little bit, but I think, yeah, keep them as 2 umbrellas. Deborah, go ahead.
How far ahead, like it mentions foreseeable damages, but sometimes things happen that were not, I mean, I'm probably opening something too complicated to bring up now, but as engineers work on things and something can fail later on, like what's your responsibility?
Yeah, so as someone who's not a lawyer, I believe the legal default is that you are protected from getting sued by other people for unforeseeable damages, but I'm not exactly sure what counts as foreseeable or unforeseeable. So for example, like with like airplanes and airplane accidents, like, yeah, that's like where it seems complicated to me.
Yeah, and Ethan, just a quick thing to jump in. I remember from the N95 decon side when we were putting out information and the lawyers were kind of like giving us advice on what we were allowed to put out versus not. I think the big point that they were mentioning is like nothing protects you from getting sued. Like people can sue you no matter what. The question is, will you win or not in court? And that comes down to the details that like there's no line, there's no like really hard line. So when you get down to these like, yeah, foreseeable versus unforeseeable, I think that's where it gets a little bit tricky, and it's like sort of some judgment call.
Yeah, that's really the point where you want to have lawyers involved, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's the goal is here to not do everything without legal opinion as well. We have many folks, including folks from the regulatory bodies and legal entities that help and advise us when we are making these sets of decision calls. And whenever a project gets to that point, we always pick up the phone and talk to them as well. So this is not about just purely avoiding that legal framework, but it's useful sometimes to have the first round so that you even know the types of questions you want to be thinking about.
Yeah, so you can think of this talk as kind of a starter kit for an early stage project. Yeah. Right. So open source licenses are a type of license which overrides some of those legal defaults of the ones listed here in order to make it easier for other people to use, share, modify your work. And then these licenses are kind of blanket licenses. In the legal term is public licenses, which means they apply to everyone. And that means that you don't have to, for every person who like wants to use your work, you don't have to do a separate legal negotiation or contract or whatever with them. You can just upload one thing and then it applies to everyone, and they don't have to ask for permission just to do those things. If they want extra permissions, then they would still have to contact you. But this kind of probably would apply to almost everyone who would be looking at your project. And so the licenses kind of contain permissions. They allow people under copyright law to make copies of your design files to distribute them, to make changes. And then, for example, under patent law, they allow people to build the hardware that your design specifies, for example, or to make or sell things. But together with those permissions, they also come with conditions. So the permissions are only granted if the conditions are upheld. For example, if the person agrees not to sue your project, if they give proper credit to your project, whatever that means, depends on the license. For some licenses, they also require that if someone wants to use your work, then they have to share any modifications they make to it under the same license or a similar license. So choosing a license is basically down to a handful of questions. The first is, if you're using some other project, do they have a license that automatically makes that decision for you? I'll talk a bit more about this in the next few slides. But if so, then you basically have to follow that, or you have to stop using their project and like remove any work from that project that you had. But for a lot of projects, they don't have that issue. And then you kind of want to look at what kinds of conditions does the license place, what kinds of permissions does it give, what kinds of work does it cover? For example, is it a software license, which only works for software? Is it a hardware license, which works only for hardware? Or is it like a media license, which only works for art and media and documentation? That distinction kind of comes down to things related to patent law and copyright law. And then another question is kind of, who do you want to use your work? So this might be companies, this might be commercial open source projects or other open source projects. That's kind of like, what's your audience? Who would be reading the license? That's kind of an important consideration. And then another one here is, because for most of these projects, we're not really at the stage where we would be talking to lawyers. And we can't really enforce the licenses without lawyers who would file lawsuits. Then it's really kind of what does the license say, and how does that fit with what norms or values or practices that you want to encourage in the community, independent of legal enforceability. The license kind of states an intention that you want your project of people who are looking at the project, how they should engage with it. For example, should they share everything they do based off your project, or is there not that expectation? And then finally, kind of how easy is the license to read and understand? Because if you choose a license, you should make sure that you understand it. It would be kind of like if you signed a contract for leasing an apartment to live in without understanding like what the landlord could charge you for or not. This is something where you do want to make sure you understand what you're signing up for by choosing a license.
Yeah, I saw a hand in the classroom. Was there a question? Yes, no? Okay, yeah, you guys should just speak up whenever you want to interrupt. Just, yeah, because some of you are very small in the screen, so it's a little bit hard.
Yeah, and I'll pause at the end of each slide just to.
Yeah.
So there are a few different kinds of licenses that exist along a few different axes. So one is kind of this permissive versus reciprocal. And I'll elaborate on this more in the next few slides, but permissive is kind of this idea that you just want to have proper credit for your work, but you don't want to have additional restrictions on what people do with your work besides them not suing you. So there's a few different licenses, many different licenses for software. These are kind of some of the more popular ones. And then there are a few licenses for hardware, and then things for documents, media, and art. So like these, you might have heard of as the Creative Commons licenses. Reciprocal licenses are ones where basically you say, if anyone uses my work, then they also have to share the stuff they did based off of my work under that same license or a similar license. So this kind of goes back to what I mentioned here. These are reciprocal licenses. And then similarly, there's lots of software licenses, there's a few hardware licenses, and then there's some Creative Commons licenses with this type.
Yeah, so let's pause a little bit here. I mean, I think one thing, I wonder if it's obvious to people, but there is a fine line between thinking about when you are actually building on other people's work. So in software, this is very obvious. You might be using somebody's library. And it turns out this sets of reciprocal licenses is exactly why the open source ecosystem has grown. Because if you build on somebody else's work, you're actually being forced to put your work in the open domain. And that has been phenomenal in terms of the context of the growth of open source softwares. Sometimes it might be that you do want to do the right set of put something in the open domain, but you use a kind of a tool, but it has a very complex license. It might actually imply that you look for alternatives. And I think of course, some of this also directly applies to certain hardware products, certain chipsets that you might be using. But one of the challenges to think a little bit about is you might be using a design tool, but the final product or an output is not. So for example, you're using a browser or you're using a tool that is in an open source domain to code, but that does not mean, so I think there is that fine line that in the final product, does that actual object exist in certain state and forms? And I think, Ethan, do you want to, if there is an example that comes to mind, I'm thinking of a very simple one. If I use a text editor that's in open source, that doesn't mean everything that I write is in that domain. But I'm wondering whether there's a more subtle example like that.
A subtle example of what?
Where you might be wondering whether you accidentally are using an open source tool or a product in your solution, and then later on you realize. I know this has happened in the past as case studies, but I cannot think of an example right now. I know this happened to us when we were using the libraries, and I know we had to juggle through for PES Global.
Yeah. I know we were using an Arduino library for controlling motors, which was GPL licensed, but we wanted to share our project under like a permissive license, which meant that we couldn't use that library. We had to switch away from it.
Yeah, so actually, yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, and the situation with that one is also kind of maybe instructive, which is that project, they release it under a GPL license for everybody. But for companies who can't actually share their code, then the person who wrote this library also offers business licenses, which is basically saying you can pay us some money and then you can use our work without sharing it. So that's kind of a business model in the software world, which is to have a reciprocal license, but then most companies can't actually use things under reciprocal licenses, so that they can sell exceptions to that as like a business license.
Aya, go ahead.
I also wanted to follow up on this with a question. What if, let's say I'm like working on this project, on the software project, and I open sourced it and I like built my project on top of other open sourced work that suddenly became licensed? What ends up happening to my work as well?
All right, are you asking about kind of some other project changing their license?
Yes, yeah.
So that's kind of complicated for the person who wants to change the license, but what it means for you as someone who's using the thing is that they can't take it back, basically. Like once the software is released under a license, it's like that license applies forever, assuming that's what the license said, which basically all of them say. If someone wants to change their license, then all they can do is they can only use the different license for their new work, the new work that they add later. And there's also kind of, it's different if you try to relicense from permissive to reciprocal. That's kind of where you can only do it with the new work, or reciprocal to permissive. I'm getting confused, and that's part of where it's really complicated.
No worries. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just historically, one thing that you all should understand and know is much of this comes from history of examples and people falling flat. All of these licenses arose because of needs, because we made mistakes in the past, and then we realized that, oh, this condition was not met. So this complex zoo is not just one person suddenly one day dreamed. This zoo exists because of complexity in the past. And unfortunately, which is kind of the key message of this talk, which we'll talk about in the very end, hardware is still in a much more of a flux. There are certain sets of things that do exist, and still much more work needs to be done in the medical space, which makes all of this even more complex. Or for example, biologics, which is what does it mean from a context of synthetic biology projects, or certain sets of genes and certain sets of solutions that are only now starting to come about in the open domain, where there is very little. So I think remember this point that all of this complexity is driven by historical context.
So I have a quick question. So for example, I do build a website software for which is licensed under a reciprocal license, but I want to share the content of my website under a permissive license. So for example, Creative Commons. How would I go about that? And
Yeah, so I don't think you need to worry about that one. With these reciprocal licenses for software, usually it's just related to software that you build using the reciprocally licensed software. But for other content, that's kind of, you're free to do whatever. And then for the traditional reciprocal software licenses, if it's a tool that you use to do something else, that doesn't place any restrictions on the licenses that you can choose for the things you built with the tools. With libraries, that's where kind of the reciprocal conditions apply. Libraries and sometimes also APIs. Yeah.
And what is the correct place to place a license if it's not just a software project? If it's both, for example, if it's both software and hardware and maybe media is involved, and can multiple licenses apply?
Right. So usually the license itself will tell you in the legal terms where you're supposed to like put some legal notices, where you're supposed to copy the text of the license, when you need to share the license file together with your other files, and so on. I think with software licenses, usually it's like when you share the software either as like an executable file or an executable script or as the source code, then you need to share the same license. And then with like, for example, with media, like Creative Commons licenses, it's usually like if you use this graphic in your slides, then you have to add a citation crediting the person who created that graphic, for example. And I think I answered part of your question, but I forgot the rest.
Yeah, so the other part was basically what happens if there are multiple domains in a project. So for example, software, hardware, and say media. Do they get licensed separately, or all of it can like fall under one, say a very open license, say Creative Commons 0 or something?
Right. So the Creative Commons licenses only apply to documents, media, art. The hardware licenses only apply to hardware. The software licenses only apply to software. So what you would usually do is you would choose like a license for your software, and then in the README, the like entry point of the documentation for your project, you would say the software in this project is licensed under this license. The hardware for this project is licensed under this other license, and the documentation, media, graphics are licensed under this other license. And then
Wonderful.
That's how you kind of specify. That's how you clarify to people which license apply to what things. Although the terms of the license also will usually say this license is for the software. It grants you permission to use the software under these conditions. And the hardware license will say we grant you permission to use these hardware design files under these conditions, and so on.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan.
Ebra, go ahead.
Just wondering about relative costs for different licenses, or is it mostly the legal fees?
So with all of the open source licenses, they're free for you to use. When you want to do business license things, that really depends on how you're trying to do the license. Usually it would look like you need to hire a lawyer, and then they'll negotiate with the other party's lawyer, and they'll work out a license, and that's very expensive because it's billing. But there are some recent projects in the software area to make it easy for someone to kind of have a form that has a contract, and you just fill out the name of the other person, and then it's smooth sailing from there. But those are kind of small projects, new projects, and I don't think the same thing exists for hardware. So I'll kind of dive into when you might want to use some of these specific kinds of licenses. So permissive license is really you're giving away your work for free, and you don't want to worry about the legal terms of the license because it's a small license, and you don't want other people to worry about the legal terms of the license. They don't need to worry about what they can or cannot do because it's usually pretty simple. Often people will use permissive licenses if they want businesses to use their work, and the caveat there is that If you are worried about financial sustainability, if you need to bring in money, then a permissive license could be a very risky option because it kind of closes off your future options for bringing in money. Then people have developed various ways to bring in money, for example, working for contracts or other kinds of things, but it's all very complicated and there are problems in the open source software world. These have limitations. If one important thing with permissive licenses is that like you should only use this if you don't care about other people not sharing things they do with your work. But one benefit of this is that because these licenses are pretty simple, they can be simple and easy to understand, which is important both for you and for other people. And then so here are kind of my recommendations. This first one is the CERN open hardware licenses. This is kind of the most popular option for open source licenses for hardware. This is kind of a lot of legal text, so it's not my favorite, but it's the best thing we have. With hardware and software, there's this very nice hardware license, which basically takes the Apache software license and says this also applies to hardware, and it just introduces some other terms like what counts as hardware and so on for the license. But that's very nice if you're doing a project where it's both hardware and software, because then someone only needs to basically look at one license, which is a software license that most people in the software world are familiar with. For a project that's only software, this is kind of my preferred thing, is to use Apache, which is that same license. And then also say people who want to can also use this newer, smaller license that's not very popular, but is easy for anyone to understand and read, which is very nice, I think. Yeah, but that's kind of my personal preference. And I think most people don't share that preference. Most people will just go with what's popular. If you're in a community that already uses one particular license or one particular set of licenses, and you're doing a project within that community, it's probably a good idea to just use that same license, just so that you kind of can enable other people to not worry about licenses. And then for media data documents, the most popular option really is the Creative Commons licenses, and this is the permissive one, which just says, please give credit for the work, but you can do anything else you want, as long as you don't sue me.
Yeah, just a comment on this. And again, because many sets of projects that we do have a notion of hardware and software, and hardware as one of the cores. So CERN came up with the open hardware licenses. This is the same CERN that builds the accelerators. And actually what's fascinating, I got a chance to talk to the CERN team, that is their legal team, and why they actually developed this license. And one of the fascinating things, just about as we know from space race, many technologies were built that transformed economies dramatically while they were trying to build tools that go to space. I mean, much of our digital era tools all come from that. CERN had a very similar vision, because it was billions of dollars of taxpayer money that was put in building and designing this tool very specifically for science. And we don't know whether that particular science would immediately be applicable. One of the key goals was that any technology that they built, and then it's literally any technology, anything that CERN does, they directly put that in that context. And it's remarkable if you go back and see, it's all the way from massive manufacturing context to just remarkable simulation tools and everything and anything under the sun that goes in at CERN. So it's quite that's the history. And of course, to a certain extent, they were at that time really thinking about larger scale projects as well. And this is why I think the SHL is an important license to also keep in mind as well, because the CERN license was really written first for CERN users. And then, of course, it's been very valuable everywhere.
So that's permissive licenses. Next, I'll talk about weakly reciprocal licenses. So this is a category of reciprocal licenses which requires people to share work that they make off of your work in certain conditions, but not all of them. So you would need to use this if you're using a project which has the same kind of license and you're building off of their work in certain conditions. You would use this if you like built a device and it has some interfaces for connecting to other modules or for people to build stuff around it. And you want businesses to be able to kind of like do whatever they want using those interfaces without having to share their work, which could be very attractive for companies. But then the caveat here is if they modify the work you did, if they made direct changes to your design or your software source code, then that's like part of your project and not their own project that talks to your project. They have to share those changes they made back. So CERN has like a version of this, which is kind of complicated. It took me quite a while to understand it, which is not ideal. And then there's in the software world, there's like this Mozilla public license, which is used for the Mozilla Firefox browser, which I think is no longer as popular as it used to be, but this is a good one. And then there's another one that's common in the software world, which is this LGPL license, which is extremely difficult for me to understand. And it's like, it comes from an older world of software where it's like you program in C and then they have these libraries and there's header files. It's weird. So I don't recommend using that for new projects, but you might have to if you're using a project that uses this one. And then of course there's the Creative Commons share alike license, which is it's not exactly weakly reciprocal. It's like kind of this next variant called strongly reciprocal, but it's kind of the closest an analog to that, where anything that anyone changes to your work or does to build upon your work, they have to share those changes back also, or they have to kind of publish their work under the same license. Yeah, so that's weakly reciprocal licenses. And maybe we can I can go over strongly reciprocal licenses and then we can talk about those two together or like the differences between them. It's kind of complicated in some cases. But the strongly reciprocal license is simpler. It basically says if you use my device design or my software, if you built your software around my software, for example, then you have to share those changes back under the same license or under an equivalent license. So CERN also has their own version of this. And then there's like the popular one in the software world is the GPL license, the GNU public license, which is also very long and kind of complicated and kind of hard to understand in some places, but it's the popular one. And so you might need to use this one. There's kind of a new license, which basically no one uses, but is human readable, which I like, but I've never needed to use it, so I can't really comment on it much more. And then the share alike Creative Commons license is basically a strongly reciprocal license. Any changes you make, anything you build off of this with, you have to share under the same license. Any questions before I move on?
So a quick comment, Ethan, and I guess, I think one of the threads for people to explore and one of the discussions that we'll have after this is learning much of this in the context of case studies, because I think the appropriate strategy for a given set of a project can be fairly complex because the goals can be very specific to what you're trying to do. Can you say a word about on the reciprocal side, even if you have a strongly reciprocal license, as long as what modifications were made and how they are made and those sets of files are shared, that does not prohibit anyone else to build a commercial business or sell the product that you might have actually built and designed, right?
Correct. Yeah, these licenses permit people to do whatever they want, basically, as long as they share the changes they made. I think most businesses, a key part of their business strategy is to keep their intellectual property secret. So for a lot of them, it doesn't work and they'll need to negotiate with you or they'll just avoid using your work at all. That's kind of often what cautious lawyers will tell businesses. But yeah, there are companies that do things with strongly reciprocal license work. They just have to share the stuff they build.
Yeah, and so I think the way to think a little bit about this as well is sometimes there is a piece of work that enables research use and science use, and you might want to write a license that, oh, for non-commercial purposes, when you are just building it as a single individual, there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, let's cover this category and then I'll talk about it.
Yeah, so non-commercial licenses are kind of controversial in the world of people who care and have strong feelings about open source software. But I'll try to kind of be neutral because I'm not one of those people. But you would use a non-commercial license if you want to withhold permission from people if profit might be involved. So often it might be that like you release your work under non-commercial license, and then people who want to like do something commercial with the software you build or like manufacture and sell the device that you design for profit, they would have to kind of email you and you would negotiate a separate license, a business license that applies between you and the other company. One other thing though is that if there's an open source project that is commercial, then they really have no options for using your work. But that might not apply to most of you. And then one final consideration here is that people who are passionate about open source are very adamant that non-commercial license does not count as open source. So you could either kind of decide not to call your project open source. You could call it, for example, source available or non-commercial. Or you could just like piss them off, because I think some people are fine to piss off. And these might be among those people. One thing though with non-commercial licenses is that there is no like hardware non-commercial license that exists that is like a standard. It's a similar situation with software. Here's one that I kind of skimmed through and like, but have never needed to use, which is kind of a clear and easy to read license. It says like there's a free trial. And then if it's like for research or personal use, then it's fine. You're not restricted. If it's for a nonprofit or a public health or safety organization or whatever, it's also fine. And that's basically kind of what it says. So that's kind of one option that you have. There are some other small non-commercial software licenses, but most of them have not taken off. And this is kind of more of a niche thing. And then with Creative Commons, there's like the non-commercial license. There's also a non-commercial share alike license, which is more restrictive. These are kind of intentionally ambiguous, and I'll kind of get into this a bit more, but often people are very confused about what non-commercial means in this license, because it doesn't really explain very clearly. What it says is like things that are not primarily for commercial advantage or monetary compensation count as non-commercial, and I personally don't really know what that means, and most people don't either. This is actually intended to be ambiguous to give people wiggle room, but I don't know if that was a good idea. So there's that. But like, what do we do about this ambiguity, right? I'll kind of get into this later in a few slides. Any questions
And I think,
or comments?
I mean, one comment to just mention here, and I'm glad, Ethan, you mentioned the ambiguity and the context of certain set of people liking or not liking the non-commercial context. I think one important thing for just everyone to remember, and again, this is a principle that we can all apply. What matters to creators sometimes and might be of something that you want to keep in mind is you deeply care about the work that you do actually reaching the people that you are building and designing for, which is the premise of this class and is the premise for designing for individuals that a lot more people might not be. But to actually reach those people, you have to be thinking about how to either be thinking about sustainability, if that's the only route. You have to also worry about factors like quality, in which you might imply a smaller number of high quality reproductions of your work might actually reach a viable population without reducing the quality of a work. And so I think this is why this landscape is complex, and these are personal decisions that you have to make, optimizing why that work was done at the first place. And how much of that process do you want to be involved in? How much of that process do you want to own? How much of the vision that you first started the project with you want to be continued? And so I think every one of these layers goes back to the very first sets of questions, which is, what are your objectives? And those objectives can change. And the reason this becomes complex is once something is launched in with a license, you cannot retroactively come back and say, I've changed my mind now. You really have to think about other sets of strategies. You can always add on to the work, but it's valuable to think about some principles that you want to adhere to in that context. And sometimes you are also looking to explore and see what the cards have in store for you in terms of what the project actually needs, because it's not always clear what the project needs are from day one.
Yeah, I think to go back to the relicensing thing, I kind of cleared my head with that. And basically the summary I'll give is that it's usually pretty easy to give extra permissions that you didn't give before, right? So if you choose a non-commercial license right now, you can always later on say, or anyone who wants to can also choose this this regular permissive license that is not a non-commercial license. So then you give people the choice to either use the non-commercial license or the permissive license, for example. And then basically you're essentially saying anyone can use it for free now for commercial purposes. But
so
really,
you can go in one direction easily, not the other way.
In the other direction, it's much harder. In the other direction is where basically you can only add more restrictions on the new work that you create. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The non-commercial license, really, this is where you would be thinking about this if financial sustainability is a key concern. So for example, there are people like independent software developers who don't want like Amazon coming in and then taking their work and then competing with them. And then so they might release their work under non-commercial license. Another thing that I just came up with this off the top of my head is, for example, if you have a design and you're partnering with a company to like manufacture your product and they want kind of an exclusive commercial rights, then you might give them a private license to do that and then release it under non-commercial license for the general public. So then other people can kind of build off the work, but they cannot compete with the manufacturer that you're partnered with, for example. Okay, so moving on. Options for licenses, kind of if you don't want to be overwhelmed, then I would recommend just starting with these ones that I've listed under my recommendations. But there's kind of, I did a much more comprehensive evaluation and comparison of various software and hardware license options, which is here. And then I looked at kind of the combinations and where they kind of match or differ for software versus hardware. You probably don't need to do that, but if you are really interested, then that is a resource. One thing that has come up is in the past, people have wondered if they can just use the same Creative Commons license for everything. So the Creative Commons Foundation really recommends against this for software. Part of it is because the license doesn't explicitly talk about software. So there could be some ambiguity about whether or not people are allowed to actually use and share and copy your source code for your software. So, and I kind of agree, there are much better tools if you're trying to share your software than Creative Commons. For hardware, it's also kind of complicated. Personally, I recommend against it. Basically, like all they apply to is like your design files, like the PDFs or the 3D printing STL files or whatever. They apply to those, but they don't apply to how people use those files. So it's kind of weird legally, right? But if you like don't care about that at all, then you could say like use the Creative Commons attribution license, the permissive license, to say, I'm just kind of giving these away for free, and then you're fine. If you're thinking about using like a reciprocal Creative Commons license, that's where it can get really confusing, because it's like it says one thing, but then you can't legally enforce it, and then that's just weird. And I don't think that's very good manners for the people who how you're presenting yourself to the people who are looking at your project. I think it's probably better to choose a proper hardware license, but you might have other reasons that you might still want to use a Creative Commons license for your hardware design files. But it's really kind of, if you choose to go that route, make sure you have read and fully understood the legal terms so you understand what you're signing up for and what protections you have and what permissions you're giving versus not, and so on. So kind of the short answer is it's complicated, and that might be a reason not to do this. So kind of to summarize things, here's kind of a checklist of the practical checklist of how to apply everything I've talked about. So the first thing is that if you're using work from other projects, you should look at what licenses they use, because they might require you to use certain licenses. If you're really unlucky, you might be using 2 different projects that require to use licenses that are different. And then that means those projects are conflicting with each other, which means you actually have to stop and remove one of those projects from your project, which is annoying. So that's one reason why often people prefer to use projects that are permissively licensed, because then they know they don't have to worry about that. Because that's only a thing that comes in from reciprocal licenses. But if you don't need to worry about this, or if you're fine, if like all your projects have permissive licenses, or if all of your projects allow you to or require you to use a single reciprocal license, then that decision is kind of made, or you can make the decision. And then once you're ready to share your work, then you actually have to commit to using the license. Before then, you can kind of keep everything private, not worry about this, delay the decision until you actually have something to share. But once you are ready to share your work and you want people to look at your work, then you should choose a license. That's kind of the deadline for you. And usually what that means is you include the license file together with the other work that you're sharing. For example, a file in a folder with other files, or you include the text of the license on your Notion document or whatever. And you should also mention this is the license we're using in the entry point for your project's documentation. That might be like the README on your software repository, or the homepage of your, or even just a link from the homepage of your Notion wiki or whatever, right? And then a best practice, which I strongly recommend, is no matter what license you choose, you should also kind of describe what your intentions are. So kind of to illustrate this, for example, if you choose the non-commercial license, you might say, we're using a non-commercial license. This is an example I took from a COVID face shield project that chose a non-commercial license, where there was some legal confusion because they used Creative Commons, and then some hospitals thought they were not allowed to use it, and then so it was just very complicated and people got annoyed. But they like posted this clarification after the fact. It would have been better if they posted it before, but sometimes we only learn by making mistakes, right? Here they say it'd be great if you donated these face shields, but if you have to cover production costs, then you can sell the shields at the cost of production, but we don't want to see you selling these at a big markup, right? And that's kind of one way you can kind of clarify to people what you mean and what you don't mean by the license that you chose. And this is also a good way for people who maybe have trouble understanding complicated legal text to at least kind of get a sense of the spirit of what you're going for and what you want to emphasize for the community that you're building, which is maybe one of those big things that you want to communicate through a license. You could say, this is, for example, explaining a weekly reciprocal license that you're free to design modules which connect to a device. And you don't need to share those designs, but it'd be great if you did. We'd love it if you did, but you're not legally required to. But if you modify our device design, then you have to share those changes under the same license. And so this can help someone who doesn't understand the certain open hardware weekly reciprocal license, which is probably most people in the world. They can at least understand how to interpret that through the intentions that you're communicating.
Yeah, and then just a comment on this: the intentions that you communicate still need to be backed up with the correct licenses.
Yeah,
because these sets of intentions are not worded. This is just a mini explanation of what you intend to actually do.
Right. So these are not like legally binding things,
That's correct.
although if the license itself is ambiguous, then these could be used legally to help understand what you meant, and that can have some weight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a way of thinking about making licenses that are harder to read to at least also reflect your intentions, which are actually very valuable. And sometimes reflecting your intentions in projects, independent, even if you are a closed source project, which many projects are, is still good. Because at any point of time later on, you might choose to open up. At any point of time, you're still looking to make the kinds of networks at any point within a given network, you might be much more open about it as well.
Yeah. And I would suggest writing this up before you even choose your license. This is really kind of, this should drive what your license is, unless you're using some third-party project that requires you to use a license. But this is really like, this is where you should start when you're choosing a license, is figuring out and getting clear on what your goals and intentions are. And then the license should be chosen to match that.
So I have a bit of a confusion over the language in you must share those changes.
Yeah.
So a person who basically makes modifications to, for example, these modules, do they have to make a, do they have to share these changes online publicly with everyone? Or if they choose to share these changes, they have to do that under this license?
So that really depends on the specific license that you use. So to take an example from the CERN Open Hardware license, I believe what they say is, and I haven't looked at this file in a year or two, and I'm not sure, I forget if they have like a single paragraph where this is explained, but I think this license basically says if you share the hardware, then you have to provide the design together with the hardware. So that could look like anyone you sell a device to, you also have to send them a zip archive of your hardware design files to. But I think the easier route that most people take, and is good for people who are lazy like me, is you just upload it to somewhere on the internet and then you provide a link. And then that's also, you can update that link that way also. So here's kind of where they say, this is like the legal term is often like conveying something. You can convey things, you can modify things, as long as you do certain things. You can make products and convey them as long as you give the person also a copy of the complete design files or the source. That's kind of one example here. This is kind of a more traditional license. For kind of some of these newer licenses that try to be shorter and clearer, often it would look like they explain clearly, like you have to contribute the changes you make, and to contribute software, it's either you publish it somewhere on the internet that's accessible to everyone, and then you also have to choose a certain license and so on. So yeah, you have to look at the license to figure that out. But usually it would be enough if you uploaded it somewhere and gave someone a link. But for most licenses, you can get away with just emailing the recipient of your hardware or software the source code. That could be a lot of work if there are a lot of people who are receiving the thing. And yeah, it really depends on your specific situation. And also, just to add, like if you send someone the source code, they can also upload it somewhere. That's permitted. So you might as well upload it somewhere yourself that you control.
Thank you.
Deborah,
I know Deborah had her hand up. Go ahead, Deborah.
Well, I always think of the worst case, like let's say you do the thing where you say, we really prefer you don't sell it for $50 on eBay. And then later on you find that somebody is really profiteering on your thing. Don't just, what's about enforcement? Does that mean you're in the hole with lawyers and going down that route?
Right. So really, like the licenses are legal tools. So they're really meant for you to get lawyers involved. So you could do that, but for most people, they probably don't care enough or don't have the resources or time to do that. And I think the most common alternative for smaller projects or community-based projects is really that they name and shame whoever's doing it. And it's like, avoid this seller, for example, or something. But that only goes so far, and that's something you just have to live with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is also just true with patents. Patents don't actually give any, you have to enforce a patent, and enforcing a patent can be an incredibly complex and expensive process. And hence, just because you applied for a patent is also not any guarantee of, that no wrongdoing would be done. So this is the world that we live in.
Yeah. So I think for that reason, I personally like to think of licenses just as a way to communicate what kind of community you want to build. Do you want to build a community of people who are sharing things back to the community? Or do you want to build a community where companies feel free to get involved or so on, right? That's really kind of more of a statement of spirit rather than something that you can actually legally enforce, because you probably don't have the money for the lawyers to do that. And then I think the other thing to include in your documentation is kind of inviting people to email you. For one, this is a good way to start conversations, and this way you can hear about what people are interested in doing with your project, which could be valuable feedback. But also it kind of gives, for example, companies or other people who are unsure if they can use your project, a way to talk to you. And that way you can either work out the specifics and you can say, oh, you do have permission to do this, or you can negotiate like a contract or a separate license where maybe you get compensated, for example, if you choose a non-commercial license, or if you choose a license that the company is not willing to do and they want to buy their own separate like private license, for example. So yeah. And I think that's really all I have in the main content. I have some additional links which we could discuss, but yeah.
Yeah, no, let's turn this into a discussion, and we will share the slide deck. And of course, this recording is there. But what's much more valuable is broader discussions. So if you unshare your screen, Ethan, and then people can just turn on videos if that's feasible. Let's any broader sets of questions. And I think what might be useful is this is the only discussion we will have around intellectual property in general. So just a few words on that. I'm assuming that all of you know what patents are and how in a university settings patents are implemented, and some of the limitations and some of the value of patents as well, which is kind of this parallel set of a universe associated with this. And I think one last comment before opening this up is, again, going back, you always want to start with that list of what do you care about in this specific project, because sometimes the way that you structure your licenses, as most of you know, projects are really driven by people, and you establishing a very clear communication enables and attracts the right kind of people to engage with you. And deters certain other kinds of people to engage with you. And that really is the true value, because then people with similar value systems come together, which is incredibly important if you're trying to do something at scale and of importance. And I think this is also one of the versions of the purpose here in the class is building that sense of trust. And clarity is important in that sense, and it's not a given for a scale of a project where sustainability is important, which route you should go. Okay, let's open this to any questions, discussions, any sets of ideas people have. Go ahead, Deborah.
Can we sign him up to talk to our center? I think this would be amazing.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about it in a kind of a future. This was my comment to the NSF. So Ethan, the comment for this is, Deborah and I are part of this NSF CCC Center, and Deborah has been championing this community for a while. And this is Stanford, UCSF, and Berkeley. And in our last report/renewal meeting, the NSF folks came back and are like, you guys are not filing enough patents. And I was almost a little bit mad, but I gave kind of this, I don't know whether that answer landed well enough.
It was perfect timing. It was great.
Yeah, and I think this is sometimes as NSF, when they see value of their funding, and again, I really want to state this very explicitly, patents are a very powerful tool. It's just that you have to make decisions for how you want to scale and grow projects. And you can patent something and also not enforce this. That's also okay. But you cannot just value work purely on number of patents filed, which is what they were evaluating us at. And so we shared a lot of open source work that we have done as a lab, not chosen to file patents. And I think many people in the center have done that. Yeah, I think, Deborah, that would be valuable. Maybe in the next internal meeting. I think this is useful for internal discussions. Mm-hmm. So not as a framework.
I agree with our community. And I just want to say to everyone else, if you apply for NSF grants, they and others talk about broader impacts and knowledge transfer. And there's many ways, but a lot of people are so biased about the disclosure, the patent, that it got really heated. and it's, but the shared, you know, the citizen science is, it's really, really important, and that's valid. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's again about global impact versus impact just purely in the US. So one type of a framework that we have been using as a key framework in our lab, also just from a sustainability, is what is called the Global Access License. So because a lot of our lab's work is funded by Gates Foundation has a clause that I signed, and a lot of people at Stanford were quite, it was a little bit of a discussion, let me put it that way mildly. Global access license is that the certain sets of technologies that are built with Gates Foundation funding, they want to engage in helping shape markets, and markets in which either the purely commercial implementation or markets in which it's not being deployed, they don't want it to be exclusively held back and a monopoly for a technology exists while there is another market where somebody else would be willing to bring that technology to at a lower price. I mean, this, you could talk about this in the context of vaccines, for example, where currently nobody else other than Moderna and BioNTech can actually make, unless they, you really have to jump the hoops in terms of thinking about licensing. So global access contracts are really around making sure that you have a market-driven strategy around access. So that's another really fun document that people should read. It's on the Gates Foundation website. They've used it for the last 10 years. And again, it continues to be developed. It's not a direct license. It's in the early phase. And many funders actually ask sometimes, like, many funders are now asking all academic work to lie in Creative Commons as preprints. So for example, CZI asks any work that you do that you have to put it in Creative Commons. So it has to be openly readable. So just the papers that we all write, for example, and it's a legal requirement from a funding source itself. Yeah, Deborah, we can plan this between you, me, and Ethan, if this is helpful for other people. I think we've done this for 3 years now, and it's useful just broadly to make sure that people know their options.
Yeah, and kind of returning to the point about patents, I think usually the best practice, if you have access to the lawyers and you're willing to do the paperwork, is to get a patent and then apply the open source license. Because I'll just share my screen briefly. Any license which is worth using will also have something about patents for hardware and for software. So for example, this is the Permissive Blue Oak license. It has a section that says, each contributor to this project licenses you to do anything with this software that would otherwise infringe any patent claims they could license or become able to license. So basically what this is saying is, we patented this, or if we patented anything in this project, you can use it to do anything. That's kind of what this license is saying. And then so all the good software licenses have some kind of grant of permissions related to patents with them.
And again, it's going all the way from, you can start with completely closed, because an idea in your head is completely closed because nobody else knows about it. And you can keep going at any layers of opening it at any given point of time as you understand the landscape.
Yeah.
And so you can, it's perfectly okay to have had first a patent. Actually, maybe one, I had this discussion with, I guess I was talking about this technology around single-use needles. Sometimes you need patents to also twist the arms of manufacturers or engaging people who would be putting a large capital to make something scale and expand. And this happened with single-use needles. Although WHO had approved it and WHO recommended it, many organizations, manufacturers of needles were not willing to change their entire manufacturing pipeline because the needles were still working and it would be a huge investment. But because certain sets of patents existed on that, that led to a market shift, because some groups of manufacturers could get access to those patents and have a certain advantage, and then it became a competition. And then eventually that has led to the retooling of a lot of syringes now. It's not 100% as yet, but there is an interesting case to be made, is how do you steer an entire field that's doing something in a direction that you would like to go. So again, a very complex set of discussions, and again, much more driven by what happens in the future rather than in an early stage. And maybe one word on OTL, and actually many groups. Every university has a group that is dedicated to helping you both understand intellectual rights and also help file. They are incredibly talented people. And I think, at least in my practice, what I have found is talking to them has always been useful, while making sure that if you are actually putting something in an open domain, you are able to share and explain. It really is a two-way communication in some sense. I have not seen an example where a technology licensing office would come back to you if you've made a good case for something, to try to put something or force your hand to put something in a closed domain. Because in their mandate and mission statements is a statement about the widest use of technology. So at least I know for Stanford, if you read their mission statement is not about highest return in value. Their mission statement is widest use of technology. Sometimes you do need return to get it to a point where it will scale, but in other cases that might not be true. And if you can make that case, it's a valuable conversation to be had. Other comments? I'm actually also curious about other countries. You know, I have a little bit of experience with the patent system in India and some experience recently in China, which is it really matters who's the first one to file. And so sometimes that becomes very complicated, because it doesn't matter whether who did the work, but if you got your patent approved, and even if it was completely plagiarized, it's actually very difficult to get rights to your own work. So that's this is why international markets are fairly complex, and there are schemes around legal firms actively filing certain sets of things and then asking you, hey, if you give me $10,000, I'll win a case for you. So I mean, you know, these markets are always evolving as well. But it's good to be, if you do something useful, only then all of this matters. And you should be proud of yourself that you did something useful that somebody wants to copy it. Diana, were you going to say something? I'm actually curious about the international context of this as well. Go ahead, Diana.
Well, my question was in another topic, but just like briefly in terms of patents here in Germany, or regarding our institute, well, it's a patent by the institute itself, so you will be only listed as the inventor of this patent. And then depending on the potential of the patent, you will file first like a German patent, and then they will go for the European patent. And that's also in terms of the money and how they like expect the project to go like further. So that was in terms of this, yeah, a little bit of what I know of how things go here. But my question was like, well, regarding a little bit of our project and similar projects in which our idea is to provide a space where people can develop their own ideas. And one thing that I don't want people to be afraid of is about intellectual property, or how to, you know, I want them to come and do things, but I don't want them to be like afraid of they're losing their intellectual property about it. So I don't know if you have any suggestions on what to do for people to be safe about this.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if I completely understood your project, but let me see. It sounds like you're trying to create a space where people can come up with ideas and work on them together and so on.
Yeah, think about Fab Labs, essentially, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then would this kind of be like different people working independently on their own projects, or is it like really people should be collaborating together or something?
It can be both, actually. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting because I had read like a PhD thesis from 2008 where someone made a platform for people to make ideas and collaborate on them. And they tried one strategy to help people with like thinking about IP and licensing. And I think their conclusion was it was kind of challenging. So yeah, if it's challenging, you won't be alone in this.
Yeah, but maybe Diana, one comment to make there is it really is about culture.
Yeah.
And when you're creating a space, if you can create a culture of sharing, if that is the goal, and the fact that people, when they come in, understand that their work is being enabled because other people decided to share their work. This is really the common principle, philosophical framework of open science, is that as we share science and capacity and capabilities from certain sense of a goodwill, that brings in people, other people, because they realize that they could not actually begin and do that work if somebody else had not done that. So this is really a sense of creating culture while being very cautious about sustainability. I mean, there's a class of projects that we're working on in, say, many of you know, on the menstrual pad side, its livelihood of people depends on these sets of ideas. And it is important. You want to empower them and not shackle them in a manner that they can actually build a life around. They can have a sustainable life and not just be dependent on philanthropy and charity. But sharing goes far beyond and is different from commercialization. Sharing is much more enabling you to build the kind of team and maybe contributors that are distributed, while you might let go of a small market that, oh, you're not the only sole maker of this around the world. But most people, the kinds of networks that you can create, an idea can spread much faster, and you might still be able to build a structure. This is why it's not a one size fits all. And this is why I don't like, Ethan, kind of sometimes that people police this framework, not realizing what someone else is trying to do. And in software, you can think about the privilege that might come from a person because, oh, they actually have a 9-to-5 job and this is just a side fund, while for someone else that they're trying to create and solve, they're also actually working on this being their only livelihood. So you want to create a culture so people don't fear talking to each other. Frankly, ideas are cheap. What is hard is implementing them and building something in the end that actually works. So in early phases, often enough, you want to create a culture where people are really open and sharing and also transparent. And that builds the kinds of teams that might be strong. And then eventually, when the time is right to share, that's when you have to make a decision. It's actually not so clear whether it's the right strategy to make this decision on day one of the project. So anyway, I think I'm very sensitive to this notion of making sure that sets of projects cannot only depend on philanthropy and charity as well.
I think for your platform, you'll probably need to allow people to choose things based on their specific situation, but then you'll probably also want to try to like enrich or select for people or encourage people who kind of fit with the spirit of the project to use that platform. Yeah, so like stating the purpose of the platform and so on, those might help.
Can I say something, Diana?
Yeah, go ahead, Deborah.
Well, just something when you're organizing small groups of people, just putting out your cultural, like this is a place of, your kind of code of conduct and trust and openness. And you could even paint it on the side of something or artistically or inside. And you're creating your own culture with what you're building.
Yeah, I remember walking into a Fab Lab in Cairo in Egypt and seeing this beautiful mural visually representing, people building and standing on top of each other in a manner to build something bigger than each one of us. And it's literally, Deborah, what you're describing, but as a visual vision. So I have to run. I'm going to do office hours. So Diana and Eduardo, if you guys want to chat, I can be online for another 10 minutes. Thank you so much, Ethan. And I think Looks like your talk today got you another speaking slot at a NSF CCC meeting, which I'll kind of coordinate.
Yeah, this was fun. Thanks for
Yeah.
having me.
This is awesome. Thanks so much, Ethan.
And Diana and Eduardo, let's just use this link itself. Tyler, can you stop recording?
Yes, I can do.